Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here today with my dairy colleagues Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and our Northeast Iowa Ag Field Engineer Brian Dougherty as we discuss today's topic with our guest Amanda Stone, talking about innovative ways to reduce heat stress in dairy cattle. So welcome back to our podcast, Fred and Brian.
Glad to be here. Beautiful, sunshiny day. Going to be about 81 degrees for us out here in Northwest Iowa.
It's great to be here, Jen. Thanks for having us back on the podcast.
Yeah, so today we're pleased to have on our podcast Dr. Amanda Stone. She's an assistant professor and extension dairy specialist at Mississippi State University. Amanda's recent work with precision dairy monitoring technologies and research with an innovative sprinkler system seemed a very fitting topic to talk about in the Midwest here, as we're all experiencing some heat stress right now. So welcome to our podcast, Amanda.
I appreciate you having me, and it's nice to be here with everyone, even though it is not 81 degrees here in Mississippi. It's a lot hotter, but your cows are still experiencing heat stress, so it's good to talk about it.
That's for sure. And actually, we've had some hotter days here in the last few weeks, closer to the 90s and 100s. So we're seeing some relief here, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
You can send it on our way when you're finished with it, please.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, before we start talking about your research, Amanda, maybe Brian and Amanda, could you both give us some indications of when cows begin to experience heat stress and the effects that it has on those cows?
Sure. So kind of the general guideline on when cows begin experiencing heat stress is when the THI or temperature humidity index is over 68 degrees. So that's something to watch for. And, you know, anybody who's milked cows in hot weather is going to be familiar with this. But one of the first things you're going to see is reduced feed intake and then the drop in milk production that goes along with that. So those are very common, symptoms of heat stress. There's other things that cows can exhibit as far as, symptoms. If you start seeing those cows breathing faster and harder, increased rectal temperatures, they start to stand up more because they're trying to get rid of body heat. They start bunching up, and that's kind of a reaction that cows tend to have when they're stressed. Things like that are what you tend to see when your animals are becoming heat stressed. So you just want to keep an eye on that. If you start seeing those cows, getting up over 100 breaths per minute, they're really getting in the danger zone there with heat stress. You need to get them cooled down immediately at that point.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said, but I would just add that I think we, as a whole industry, not just the four of us in this pretend room here, right? We tend to lessen the severity of heat stress. So we always say, and you'll read it all over the place, right? Cows start experiencing heat stress at a THI or temperature humidity index of 68. But that's actually when we're seeing those results, right? So they're clinically reacting to what is happening to them physiologically from that heat, but they really are experiencing it well before that. I don't know that we know exactly for reproductive issues or exactly for milk yield or exactly for any of these other things that they're going to display clinical signs of heat stress to us for. I don't know that we know the exact threshold, if you will, as to when they will start to experience that. But 68 is kind of the magic number that we've found that goes across, states or regions. Since it's a lot more humid here, it would still apply to you all because it's a humidity and temperature index, right? But it's important to not look at that as the magic number to start implementing heat abatement strategies. And I think that's part of where we get in trouble, is that we don't realize that they are experiencing it well before that. So we really, when we're not hot, they probably still are hot. So we need to start acting before it becomes too detrimental at that 68.
Well, let's follow up on what Amanda just said. What are some recommendations you have for producers who house dairy cattle in freestall barns to reduce heat stress?
So fans and sprinklers are very important. And I would say most of the freestall facilities that I've been to, at least, I'm sure not all, but most of them have at least fans in them, but probably also sprinklers too. So that's kind of the accepted best practice for freestall cooling. You need to make sure that your fans are on though. I go to a lot of farms that have really nice facilities and really nice cooling systems, but if you don't actually utilize them, they're not doing anything. And the angle of the fans is very important. And Ryan, you're the engineer, so I'm sure you could give us a lot more information than what I can give you about having 45 degree angle with the fans and all of that. But there's a lot of information out there for producers to set up their cooling systems effectively. Because really, if you spend that much money on something, you want it to be as perfect as you can have it, right? So spend the money in the right places and making sure you do it the right way so that it will last a long time and effectively cool your animals.
Yeah, I would, just second everything that Amanda said. When it comes to the freestall area itself, the main thing we want to focus on there is what is that actual airspeed in the cow resting area. So that's an important measurement to look at. We want absolute minimum airspeed in the freestalls of around 200 feet per minute or 2.25 miles per hour. And again, that should be considered bare minimum. And you want that to be throughout the freestall area. Check for dead spots where you don't have any air movement and use some recirculating fans or things like that to target those areas. The other thing that wasn't mentioned, just the importance of providing lots of fresh water. Make sure you've got adequate water space, make sure those cows aren't, lacking in fresh water intake, because that's going to be critical to help keep them cooled down. And then Amanda mentioned, spending the money or targeting the areas that are most important, you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So the holding area is really critical. That's probably in a freestall setup, that's going to be your most stressful area in the barn. So that'd be the first place you're going to want to spend some money. Make sure you've got really good ventilation and probably evaporative cooling as well in that holding area. And just make sure if you do that, don't put in just sprinklers in the holding area. You have to have fans with those sprinklers to make that evaporative cooling work. Otherwise, you can make it even worse by driving your humidity even higher. So you've got to have the air movement to go along with those sprinklers. The milking parlor, and the second area, after the holding area, that I would probably target. And then don't forget about your dry cows as well, your pre-fresh pens. A lot of research coming out, just talking about the importance and the economic cost of not cooling those dry cows. So those are really the priority areas. And then after that, focus on the freestall area itself.
And Brian, I know we're, a month or two into our heat stress abatement strategies. What about some tips on maintenance of those fans and sprinklers? If they're not running efficiently, it's probably going to reduce performance and then overall, our effectiveness of heat abatement, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a critical part of it. Is one thing I recommend to anytime I talk to producers is put somebody in charge of fan maintenance and sprinkler maintenance on your farm and put it on the calendar and have it scheduled. I get on a lot of farms where, you can just see that the belts are slipping on the fans or they're caked in dust, that coating of dust and bird droppings and whatever you got on your fan blades, that can drastically reduce the output on those fans. Then obviously if the belts are slipping, fan air output isn't linear. It drops off exponentially when that fan blade starts to slow down. So it's really critical to keep everything maintained, and don't forget about your thermostats. If those are covered in dust, those fans aren't going to turn on and off when they're supposed to. So, just pay attention to maintenance, put somebody in charge of it. If you're in a fully mechanically ventilated facility, you probably should be checking those fans over once a month, cleaning the dust off. If you're in a naturally ventilated barn and you're just using kind of the hanging or recirculation fans, at least once a year, make sure you go through and service everything and clean them off in the spring before it gets hot, more often if possible.
Well, let's switch gears here a bit and, move out from the freestall barn out into some pasture-based cattle. So Amanda, I know a lot of your research was focused on pasture-based cattle. And so much like your producers, we have producers here in the Midwest utilizing pasture systems across age groups, anywhere from heifers to our milk cows. And so that can be another area of heat stress, right? Because we have different ways of pasturing those animals. They may not have as much access to shade or any type of sprinkler type systems or fans. So can you describe how you're using your precision dairy monitoring technologies to evaluate heat stress in dairy cattle?
Sure. So like you mentioned, we have a lot of pasture herds in Mississippi, and everywhere has a lot of pasture herds, not necessarily for the lactating cows, but for the other generations and dry cows. Like I think Brian or Fred already mentioned that dry cow heat abatement is extremely important. And there's a lot of work coming out of the University of Florida that talks about that too, if you're interested in looking at more of that. It's very interesting. So we're trying to utilize precision dairy monitoring technologies on lactating cows, because that's more of our focus, what we have on our pasture herd. We have a lot of animals on pasture, but we also have a freestall facility too. So we consider them two separate herds at Mississippi State University's dairy farm, but they're on the same property, not too far from each other. So we are able to look at these precision dairy monitoring technologies. So those are just tools that you put in or on the cow or in the milking parlor that can monitor behavioral, production, or physiological changes within the cows. We've been using a lot of leg tags. So it's basically the same technology and accelerometer that's in your iPhone, where if you turn it sideways, the screen knows to turn with you, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at with our cows, so that we can tell when they're lying, when they're standing, how many steps they're taking, which is really important in a pasture herd in particular, because if you have too much area for them, especially in a shade tree type system, the sun moves, right? So it moves over the pasture. So if you have shade in one part of the pasture in the morning, those cows are going to have to go to the whole other side of the pasture in the afternoon or evening to be able to still get that shade effect. And it makes it a little bit more difficult if the pasture is massive. That from a nutrition standpoint, it might be good because they have a lot more grass, but they're walking a lot, and walking creates more heat. So there's a lot of things that you can track with just a basic accelerometer, but there are also a lot of other technologies out there. We're starting to try to dip into GPS systems that you can't use in freestall facilities. You can use real-time location systems in freestalls, but the roof doesn't let you GPS. So we're working with some engineers, and we're very interested in understanding when and why they go to shade or to a mister or out in the sun, like what is causing that behavior. Because if you've watched cattle that have access to both of them, they don't always make the decision that I feel like I would make at that instant, right? So I want to understand what is causing them to make those decisions. And it doesn't always seem like, anecdotally at least, that it's a herd response. It seems like it must be something physiologically. So maybe their specific temperature is different than the cows next to them. So they need to go to this spot instead, or they need to go drink water, or they need to eat, or whatever the situation is. But I want to understand kind of what those triggers are for these animals, so that we can create systems that benefit them the best. So if we learn that shade is actually terrible for them, which I'm not saying is going to happen, but if we learn that, then we can start telling producers, we really found that they're going to pick shade, but it's actually not the best situation for them. So you need to remove that from your area and do this instead. Right. So I just want to understand from a cow's perspective, what is the best system for them? And we're using temperature monitors for that too. I don't have as much belief in those systems as I do in the accelerometers, because so many things affect temperature, especially when they're outside in a really hot environment. But we mostly use particular rumen temperature monitors, so that it's supposed to be more core body temperature instead of rectal temperature, which does vary even more so.
Yeah, so Amanda, you mentioned misters earlier. So you've done some work on something called the Mississippi mister. So I'm kind of intrigued by that design. Can you just explain to us, what that is, how it works, and do you think that's something that we could adapt to work here in the Midwest?
I would love for you to take it and adapt it, but with the caveat that if you improve it, please tell me, so that I can tell everybody else who's already utilizing it so they can improve it. It's a really simple system, just basically PVC pipes, some glue, some hoses. I won't pretend to be an engineer because it is, I'm sure when you look at it, Brian, you're like, oh my gosh, they should have done this like completely differently. But we did what we could figure out how to make it work for the cows. And it has worked. And we've had the same system for 3 years now. But it finally, just in my last grad students project a couple months ago, they finally just fell apart. So we're gonna have to start rebuilding them. But there is a fact sheet. Let me find the website address so you can find it here. It's extension.msstate.edu/publications/the Mississippi Mr. More Affordable Way Cool Pasture Animals. So you can find that, and maybe Jennifer can link it within the notes or something, but it gives you step-by-step directions on how we built ours, because we want you to be able to do that. Like, I'm not trying to make money or anything off of this, right? I want people to take this and utilize it if they see the need for it. We have a center pivot system on the Mississippi State University herd, and that's kind of where the idea came from. And it was not just my idea, it was a lot of other people contributing to it, but we wanted to be able to cool certain pieces of the pie in the circle so we can rotationally graze our animals on the center pivot. But we couldn't figure out how to utilize the center pivot to cool multiple pastures at the same time, but then not cool the pastures that we either wanted shade or no cooling on. So that's kind of where this idea came in, that this is low enough that the center pivot can fly or go over the misters, but it's sturdy enough that the cows don't mess with it too much. Of course, they'll be curious when you first put it out there. But it has been amazing to watch the animals with it. The results have been really cool too. But even just in the beginning, just seeing the animals, how much they utilized that system, and they were so much cleaner and they were able to eat more, it seemed like, because presumably they were cooler, right? And so when we looked at the data of all of this, we did find a lot of benefits of putting these just simple PVC pipe misters that cost for us 3 years ago less than $130, I think, for each. So depending on how many cattle you have, how many cows you have in your field, right, you would need to vary that. Calves need less space and heifers need less space than lactating cows. So you would have to adjust for all of that and find a system that works for you. I don't have all of the answers because we've just been exploring this. But really, if you do utilize it and you have suggestions that we could share with other producers, I'm sure everyone here on the podcast would be happy to share that information so that we all can help solve the heat stress problem, because it is a huge problem for our industry.
Okay, Amanda, you'd mentioned in there that it was used for calves and heifers and cows, and I'm going to just shift the discussion a little bit. I know Jen and I talk fairly often about heat stress in milk calves in hutches. What can we do to make sure that they are not as stressed as some of these hutches when I go in and see these extreme temperatures in the hutch?
Sure. So calves are difficult, more so I think than lactating cows, because they are usually in some sort of hutch system or stall system, right, where they can't actually help themselves, if you will. So it's a little different than lactating cattle or even dry cattle. When we have them out on pasture or in a barn, they can make some adjustments to what they need, whereas calves really, they can't. So they are completely dependent on what we provide for them. In my opinion, the number one thing we need to provide is a lot of fresh, clean water for these calves. I see a lot of producers who don't give water to their calves early enough, in my opinion. So at least from the third day, but really preferably from the time that they're born, they should have access to water, because that's what's really going to cool them the most. Ventilation is, of course, important, making sure that their stalls or their hutches are able to have air flow through them, which we don't have as much of as you all, unfortunately, because we don't get breezes. Our air is pretty stagnant. It's just the humidity just sits there. But you can set up systems. You can put hutches in a facility, or you can put pens in a facility and provide cooling for them. So you can put I wouldn't put sprinklers in them necessarily, but you can put fans in their facility to cool them. And that's where, at least here, that's where some producers are headed, because it's just really hard in hutches to cool them as much as you really want to cool them. Do you have any other suggestions on it?
Yeah, I would just follow up on what you said there with the hutches. You mentioned the importance of having openings and having ventilation in those hutches. Another thing you can do in hot weather is just, lift those hutches up and put them on some blocks. You're still keeping them in the shade that way. They're still protected from rain, but you can get a lot more air movement through and, get some ventilation down where that calf is going to be laying. That can really help a lot, in these hot summer days.
Very good. Okay, this question is for both Brian and Amanda. As you both have resources to share on heat abatement strategies, where can we direct producers to go for more of this information?
Yeah, I would encourage people to check out the Iowa State University Extension Dairy Team website. So you can find that at extension.iastate.edu/dairy team. And so there's a facilities tab link on there. And if you go to that, you can find lots of resources for heat abatement strategies. The Extension Dairy Team also has a YouTube page, so you can find lots of information there. We just did a heat stress webinar that's you can find on the YouTube page. And then the University of Wisconsin Dairyland Initiative also has a lot of great information on heat stress abatement. So if you just do a web search for Dairyland Initiative, you can find that as well.
Of course, I'm going to plug Mississippi State because that's where I am. So if you go to the Mississippi State website, extension website, we have some resources, but I'm actually very jealous when you say like the dairy extension team, because we don't have that really here. We are not as big a dairy state as Iowa or Wisconsin, unfortunately. So there are a lot of other resources, a lot of other land grant universities that have more resources than we have. But if you do want information on the Mississippi Mister, or I think I have some on there about how to score for heat stress, how to check for respiration rate, that type of stuff, they are listed on our website, extension.msstate.edu. And you can find the publications from that point. But I would also encourage you to see what other producers are doing. I rely on that a lot. So I'm a three-way split in my current appointment. So I do teaching, research, and extension. And to me, all of those three branches, if you will, really fit well together if you pay attention to all of them together, because I learn so much from my producers that I can then teach my students, which then goes into the research that we do, right? Because we need to do things that producers can actually utilize. And I really don't want to come out with research that says you should invest in this $10 million cooling facility, because nobody's going to do that, right? Nobody has the money to do that in the dairy industry currently. So finding things that producers are either already doing or are capable of doing is where my research sits. So we're very happy to be able to apply that to extension and to teaching, of course. But I think looking at what other producers do will help at least give you an idea of where you're sitting. You don't want to always compare yourself to your neighbor. So compare yourself to others and to yourself, okay? But it is important that producers know what they're doing, right? Like if you go to farms, you will see some really amazing technologies, innovations, and just really kind of know-how. Just they're smart. So really do try to rely on producers who might be able to help you. And in my experience, I'm not from Iowa, so I don't know about your producers, but in my experience, dairy producers are very kind and very happy to help other producers. So give someone a call and give your extension agent or your specialist a call and get them to get you in contact with somebody who maybe has a system that you are interested in, and you can go and take a look, or you can call them and get some more information, because that way you know that someone's actually able to use it. You're not just relying on somebody who may or may not actually apply that on their real farm, right? Because that's important. You need to know that it's actually going to work for you and not just work on paper.
Some very good points, Brian and Amanda. And yeah, I would echo your thoughts, Amanda, on producer input. We have some field days coming up the end of July, and I think that's where we make the biggest connection, is getting those producers on other people's farms. And that's where they, glean some of those good ideas and take those back to their own farms. So great points. So thank you again for providing our listeners with innovative ways to keep our cows cool this summer. I think it's great that we can share across states, how you're cooling your cows. Maybe we can adapt some of that to our state here and vice versa. So really appreciate you being on the podcast here today. Any last thoughts as we conclude our podcast, Brian or Amanda?
Yeah, we mentioned this earlier, but I just want to, reiterate again the importance of fan and sprinkler maintenance. So again, just make sure you're keeping an eye on that and you've got somebody in charge of making sure that gets done. And the other thing I would mention, if you've got questions about ventilation, we talked about air speed and some different things today. If you're curious what it is in your barn, don't hesitate to reach out to your nutritionist or your veterinarian or call your local extension office. Oftentimes these people will have wind speed meters and some of these other tools that you need to do some of these measurements. So, just reach out and, try to connect with somebody who can help you out with doing a ventilation assessment.
Yep, I agree with that. I think people just need to work together to help solve this problem, because it's not going to go away. It's going to be hot for a lot longer and for many more years. So we just need to do what we can to help each other, help our animals get through it, and don't just focus on the lactating animals, because they are important, but we know through research that the other groups are also, particularly your dry cows. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to email you or call or whatever, feel free to contact me. My information is on the Mississippi State website. So feel free to let me know. And if you ever want to visit Mississippi and see humidity, you're welcome to come down here and see what it's like. But I really appreciate you having me. And I hope that we were able to contribute something that producers can utilize.
Great. And as we conclude here today, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.